Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.
Hello and welcome to Northern Lights TV program. I'm here today in the fall of 2001 with Dr. Stephen Hoffbeck of Minnesota State University-Moorhead, and we are located at Phelps Mill, a few miles west of Fergus Falls, Minnesota. And we'll be talking today about his book, The Haymakers, a chronicle of 5 farm families, published by the Minnesota Historical Society Press in 2000. Hello, Steve, and welcome to Northern Lights.
Thanks, Pete. It's nice to be here.
Quite picturesque scene that we have here. Tell me about how you came to write the book, The Haymakers.
Well, with the book, The Haymakers, I had it in my mind that somehow I wanted to explore my own family history and the things that happened to my family. And then I read a book about haymaking in Vermont. And it was a story of 3 or 4 different farm families in Vermont. And I thought, well, this would be a great idea to maybe do this in the state of Minnesota. And I thought it would work. And I thought maybe my own family could be one of the subjects of one of the chapters. And so I simply explored the issue, took a look around, poked around, and found 5 different farm families in 5 different parts of the state of Minnesota. And they were from 5 different ethnic groups. And it's also 5 different ways of making hay. So it starts way back in 1862 when the Civil War is raging and the Dakota conflict is raging in Minnesota. And a fellow comes over here from Sweden. He's a Swedish Baptist, and he gets himself a farm by Waconia. And by 1862, he and his wife have several small children, and he has to face some issues. What do I do in the summertime of 1862? Do I go fight in the Civil War? Do I fight against Native Americans possibly to defend his own home and his home farm? But this man, Andrew Peterson, simply makes his hay in the summer as a farmer is supposed to do, and he makes his hay right in the middle of the Dakota conflict. And I think that makes it a rather powerful story as to what farmers actually do. And so he makes hay with the horses. He uses the old scythe, as Minnesotans would call it, more than the scythe. And so he cuts the hay. He and his wife helps him with raking the hay. And then they make the haystacks out in the field, and then in the wintertime, then they bring them to feed the cattle. And that's the first chapter. The second chapter deals with the farm family right here by Phelps Mill. It's the Oliver Perry Kaiser family. And for Perry Kaiser, he gets a second start in life. He started out in upstate New York, but he brought several of his children and his wife when he was about 50 years old to the area right by Phelps Mill, just a mile away from where we're at. And he gets himself a farm with land that was railroad land from the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba Railway Company. So he gets the land from James J. Hill, and he sets up his family in 1883. He wrote a diary, and his grandson actually left the diary in the County Historical Society in Fergus Falls. And so I used that year, 1883, as a framework to tell the story of Perry Kaiser and his family. Later on, the family moved right next to the mill, and right now there's a store there in that location where Caroline, his wife, had their property. And so he's a Yorker here in Minnesota in 1883, and he was of the Seventh-day Adventist faith. The next family is right by the Melrose area. It's the town of Meyer Grove. It's one of the most unique communities in Minnesota because it's got a barn right in the middle of the village. It also has another barn on the other edge of town. And for this family, it's a German Catholic family. The title of the chapter is Farming Forever. They've been farming for 5 generations by 1924, and they intended to keep on farming for 5 more generations. And that's the story of mechanical farming. For Perry Kaiser, he used the mechanical mower, and that's what Mr. Marthaler, Gilbert Marthaler, also will use in his family. They also use a hay loader, so it's mechanical hay operation using horses still in the 1920s. That's said in 1924. The next chapter involves a family up by Fertile, Minnesota in the Red River Valley, and that's the Doug Rung family. Art Rung was his father. It's said in 1959 when Doug was about 14 years old. And so he was just confirmed, and in that year his grandfather died, and it's making hay with square bales in 1959 and using tractors and elevators and all that to fill their round barn by Fertile, Minnesota. The last family involved is my own family. The setting is 1984, and this is haying with the great big tall blue silos in southwestern Minnesota by the town of Morgan. It's my own Hoffbeck family, and it's my brother Larry. He was 32 years old back then in 1984, and so he made hay using the great big blue silos and making haylage. And so it's 5 different farm families, 5 different areas of the state, 5 different technologies, but some of the themes are very much the same. It's about the life cycle on the farm, and the book actually starts out with a quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson. It's where Emerson talks about each farm is almost like a chapter in the Bible. You get so many things happening on one farm place and one family that it could be a chapter in the Bible. And so the various themes in there involve life and death issues. It involves close calls on the farm. It's about the rhythms of life on the farm, patterns on the land as people put their patterns on that land. Those are some of the themes found in the Haymakers.
In the book you start with technology. Explain a little bit about how you came to learn about the different types of technology that have evolved in the haymaking field.
As I set out to do this book, one of the main goals was to capture the ways that hay was made in the past. This is common everyday things. These would be common everyday things that people really didn't write down. How do you make hay in 1883? How do you make hay in 1862? And so I took the information from the diaries, and in each of these years it's a description of how that family made hay, but it's also the other things that took place in their lives in that year, and then we follow them through to the end of their lives as an epilogue to each chapter. And so in order to illustrate this, we needed a number of photographs, and we've got over 50 photographs. The MHS Press, Minnesota Historical Society Press, was willing to make it clear how you made hay in different time periods. So one of the challenges was to describe how do you cut hay with the scythe, and so I had to talk to people to find out how you work it almost like a metronome, as far as you're going back and forth, and swinging at the waist. You keep your arms pretty much straight. And I talked to a farmer by Barnesville, Minnesota, Jeff Stanglin. He helped me understand how you actually swing the scythe, because when I was a kid, we always had one hanging up in the granary, but I never knew how to swing one. And it does take practice, it does take experience. You have to have a certain knack, but you also have to have a very sharp scythe. And so they constantly will sharpen this, they'll stop in the field and then sharpen the scythe. So the technology is important in various stages, but also we take a look at the Armstrong method of making hay, where you have to cut it using your arms, you have to stack it using the pitchfork, you have to haul it on the hay racks, and you have to then make a haystack. So we managed to capture the technology of making hay in different time periods. And then it changes. By the time you get the machines, then farming is a little bit faster. You can make the hay a little bit faster because you can use the machine to cut the hay. And some people have remarked that they marvel at the fact that it took so much work to cut hay and to make hay back in the 1860s. By 1883, it's a little bit easier to make the hay, but we've got photographs that show the different kinds of technology, the different machines. And so we've captured at 5 different time periods the ways that people would make hay in Minnesota. The last of these is taking a look at my brother's method of making hay with haylage, and here everything almost is turned upside down, because you end up making your hay during the nighttime because you're able to keep the moisture in the haylage in 1984 by that method, and then you can work really fast during the night. But my brother Larry made the hay, and my two other brothers, Chris and John, would help him make the hay. And so they can work very, very quickly. Sometimes they're working at night, and it's a little bit disorienting because you're working with a very tall silo. You have to go sometimes up to the top of the silo, this big blue harvester, to make sure that nothing is plugged up. But then you also have to get up the next morning to milk the cows, and sometimes my brother worked literally all night long. At one point, my brother Chris was out in the hayfield and he was chopping the hay, and you constantly make smaller patterns, smaller circles all the time, so eventually in the middle of the night, it was a starless night, a cloudy night, no moon out, and he was lost, and he was only about a quarter mile from the house. And so my brother Larry, as he always did, had to come on out and then show my brother Chris the way home. And it's pretty much the relationship of my brother here as the father figure for my family, which brings up another theme of the haymakers. It's all about families and families made hay with threshing of the wheat and the other grains. It was more of a neighborhood process. You could stack up the wheat and then wait until you could get the threshing machine over. But with haymaking, you literally had to make hay while the sun was shining, because if you had too much rain on the hay, then it would ruin it. And so in July, it would be the traditional haymaking month. You've got to make that hay quickly so you get your whole family together. And so families work together to make hay in all of these various time periods. And so it's about fathers and sons, and it was sort of like making a connection with my own father, because I was age 15 when my father passed away in a farm accident. That was back in 1968. And so I remember that time left quite a deep impression upon me at age 15. And so I wanted to remember my father in all of this, and also to remember my brother Larry, who was my father figure. And so I took a look at the year 1984 when he was making haylage, and that was the year that my brother also passed away in a farm accident. So they were twin tragedies on the same farm place. They occurred within 100 yards of each other, and I needed to come to grips with what had happened with my own brother in 1984. So in writing this, I went back to kind of take a look at the grieving process, and somehow I think it helps people who have gone through these deep personal losses to read it, and then they understand what happened to different families in different time periods. There will be a tragedy for every farm family. It's much like that Emerson quote, taking a look at each farm family as a chapter in the Bible. And so there will be death on the farm, but there also is the theme of triumph. As we take a look at the cover of the book, The Haymakers, it's got a picture of a boy holding up the hay, and it's a picture of triumph. He has managed to persevere. He has made the hay. He's finished with the task. And in Boy with Hay, that's one of the themes, really, that you can get through all of these things that happen on the farm. Another theme that we deal with in the book is the theme of close calls on the farm. And so I take a look at my father's close call back in the 1950s, and there's a photograph it's right at the beginning of the book, and I really can't stand to look at the photograph because my father got his clothing tangled up in the combine back in the 1950s, and later he would get tangled up in the PTO shaft of the combine in 1968, and then that would kill him. But as I take a look at the close call themes, many people have read the book from farm families in Minnesota. They say that they remember the close calls that they've had on the farm. And after you've had a close call, you know it's a life or death matter, and farming is one of the most dangerous occupations in all of the land, in all of the United States. And so after you've had a close call, all you can do is basically just sit down and be thankful that you've made it through that point, and maybe reevaluate where you've been or maybe where you're going.
There's a section that deals with the hay loft and the hay barn. Tell me about the theme of how that brought communities together.
Well, with the hayloft theme, I have a portion of the book. It's a small portion, but it's about hayloft memories. And for farm kids, there's no place quite like the haymow or the hayloft. It's where you would work, it's where you would play, and some of the farm children would be sinning there as well. And so it takes a look at how do you fill up this hayloft in the summertime. And that was one of my jobs, was to work with the square bales. They're actually rectangular, but to fill up the hayloft to the very brim to get as much winter feed for those cows as you possibly can fit in there. And so it's all about the aroma of hay, and there's nothing like the smell of new mown hay, or even the smell of hay in the wintertime when you're feeding it to the cows once again. And so I would think about the heat in the hayloft, and if this book succeeds, you can kind of feel the heat in summertime, the heat in the hayloft as well. And I think of after I was done with a load of hay, about 100 bales, then I'd slide down the old John Deere elevator, and then I get a chance to take a break. So I'd go to the house underneath the box elder tree, and then I'd get some lemonade while my brother Jeff went out to get another hay rack load of hay from the field. So my father would be stacking the hay, or my brother Larry would be stacking the hay on the hay rack. And so it's partly about the heat of summer and the heat of haymaking, but it's also about the refreshment, as far as there's a recipe for switchel, which is way back in the 1880s and earlier. It's a combination of vinegar and some other spices, and it's very refreshing, so readers could actually make some switchel and see how they like it. But I enjoyed the lemonade so much. Other families would have other traditions, but I still remember my Uncle Laverne Dames, and he was one that I often helped with the haymaking, and he always enjoyed the Kool-Aid. And nobody could drink more Kool-Aid than Uncle Laverne. He'd have just about a pitcher full for himself, and for the other helpers, they got another pitcher full of Kool-Aid themselves.
The Haymakers won a 2000 Minnesota Book Award, which is very... tell me about that. Tell me about your experience being this your first brush with the publishing world, and the success that you have had.
Well, I was very gratified by the Minnesota Book Award, and I think that the book struck a chord with a number of readers on the farm. And one of the things that I was real concerned about was how country people look at the book. And basically the people on the farms have told me that they either remember close calls on the farm, or it brings back good memories of their days on the farm. And that was one of my main goals, is to make sure that it would be a chronicle of farming in Minnesota. As far as the process of writing it, it was a 6-year process, and this was the first book that I ever wrote, so it was quite a learning experience for me. I had written articles about Minnesota history before, but to write a book, somehow you have to make sure that all the chapters match. And so I've got chapters where I'm looking at diaries, I've got other chapters where I'm talking to people, it's oral history interviews, I've got the fact that I'm so close to my own family, how do I make everything match up? And so working with the editors at Minnesota Historical Society Press, they managed to help me fit everything together and to make so that there would be common themes throughout. And in order to make it work, we ended up putting in interludes. These are experiences of my own as I was growing up, and I think it helps the reader make sense of all the close calls. So we take a look at the close calls for my own family with my father with the combine the one time, but also taking a look at a close call with death that my Uncle Vernie had in World War II. Vernon C. Hoffbeck served in the Army in the retaking of the Philippines, and in February of 1945, a Japanese grenade exploded, and he managed to live through that. That was a close call. And so I have my cousins, because he lived 50 years afterwards. He was age 25 at that point, but he managed to live to age 75. So I talked to my uncles and aunts as part of this, but we had to make sure that the themes pretty well fit from chapter to chapter. We also had to put in enough of the photographs so people could see the technology, but you also have to see photographs of the people so you can understand who we're talking about. And I think the focus on an individual in a certain time period helps the reader relate both to the technology and to the various themes of hard work on the farm.
The farm crisis of the mid-'80s, early to mid-'80s, seems to be an underlying theme as well. Could you tell me how you came about to include that in this book?
Well, by the 1980s, farmers in Minnesota faced huge difficulties. We had, in the 1970s, the high inflation brought on by the OPEC oil embargo, and so land prices had actually gone up by the 1970s due to inflation, but then in the 1980s, everything crashed as far as land values. And so my brother had to face issues as to what do you do with a farm anyway? If you only have 160 acres in southwestern Minnesota, or 166 acres, how do you make a living for your family? And so, like most farm families in the 1980s, my brother's wife, Wendy, had to work outside of the home, outside of the farm. And by the 1980s, you had to have a line of credit in order to keep on farming. And so it really became agribusiness instead of maybe husbandry, as farming used to be called. And husbandry so much involves taking care of the animals and taking care of the land, taking care of the plants, and really taking care of your own family as well. How do you merge agribusiness with husbandry? And that's one of the things that my brother had to face. He had to look at, should I expand my operation some way? He decided to expand by going up, by building harvest store silos, which was an expensive way to go. But basically it was a danged if you do, danged if you don't sort of a situation. He could have bought more property, but then he would have ended up with financial difficulties trying to buy land at $3,000 an acre. Now it's more like $1,600, $1,800 an acre. But then it was at a historic high. And for my brother, at some times, he had to ask the banker for some more money just to keep operating, because your crops come in at a certain time, you have your slack times. Being able to milk cows, he had more of a steady income, which helped him in that time period, but he also had to work so hard. But the banker would give him guidelines that he had to follow in order to get the loans from the bank. And there's a question really of morality. Who's really running the show? Is the farmer able to farm the way that he needs to farm? There also is the question of the equipment on the farm, and we will see that for farm manufacturers, sometimes the safety equipment didn't last as long as the equipment itself. So the shields would start to wear out before the equipment would wear out, and then farmers throughout all these generations would have to decide, is it time to replace my equipment, or is he going to be working with outmoded equipment, in fact, equipment that is downright dangerous? And so my brother faced those issues in 1984, and as the book relates, it ended tragically, and so my family ended up getting out of farming. So a part of this book was really coming to grips with, what do you do when your home place is no longer in your family? Now, my mom still owns 110 acres, and it is our intent, as we had 9 kids in my family, to try to hold that land together. And my youngest brother, John, who works for 3M Corporation, he lives in Woodbury, he works in St. Paul, but he would like to keep some of this land in the family name. And so for my family, the question is, when my grandfather came over here to this country from Denmark in 1911, how do you keep a legacy? How do you keep your connection with the land? And that's partly what the Haymakers book is all about, connections to the land, and for me, really connections to my own brother and a connection to my father. And eventually, as I talked to many farmers about this book, I had to ask myself the question, can a farmer really farm without his father? And as I took a look at this, I find that it's awfully difficult to be a farmer if your father is not around. And then for my family, we had to face the loss of our father and also of our father figure. But through it all, my mom was a faithful woman, and her faith managed to help her get through all of these tough times on the farm, so that she still lives in Morgan, Minnesota right now, close to the family farm.
For someone who wanted to quickly just pick up the book and look at it, what would be would this be a journey for them to rediscover farming?
Well, I think the purpose of the book is really to inform the people from the city as to what it takes to put food on their table. And that's partly what the Haymakers is all about. It's about those farmers who have to work with, they have to struggle against the weather, they have to struggle against time in order to literally feed the world. But it also is to remind those people from the country about the past. And we're not talking about nostalgia here. One definition that I've heard of nostalgia is that it's memory with the pain removed. And in here, in every chapter, there will be some painful episodes for each family, because there will be a tragedy for each family at some time or another. And I used to think, well, maybe my family is alone in this, and that we suffered some back in the 60s and 1980s. But then, as I take a look at each family, there's some tragedy, and you might have to ask yourself the question, which is tougher to get through, a death in the family, or maybe a divorce, or maybe drug addiction or alcohol addiction or mental illness, I really can't say that one thing is any tougher perhaps than another. And the Haymakers helped me through the difficulties in my life. To write it, I came to understand what had happened to my own family just a little bit better. And in fact, some people recommend the Haymakers as, there's kind of a farm outreach program. It's called Rural Life Outreach. And for people who have financial difficulties here in the farming crisis of about the year 2000 or so, at the turn of our new century, sometimes it helps them put things in perspective.
Well, for the Northern Lights TV program from near Fergus Falls, Minnesota, we're here with Steve Hoffbeck, author of The Haymakers, a chronicle of 5 farm families from Minnesota Historical Society Press, and quite a beautiful location, and thank you for being with us today.
Thanks, Pete. Well, I think that farm kids always got a sense of accomplishment from making the hay. Even though it was probably the hardest work on the farm and the most intense, you knew that you had accomplished something important by the time that you were done with that work for the day. And I think sometimes for people these days, as they work in their office jobs or producing information, you wonder, what am I really making? What am I really doing for people? But for the cows, it would be a matter of survival during the winter. For the horses, they needed the timothy hay. So it's partly about the memories of the clover, of the alfalfa, of the timothy grass, and turning it into hay. That's part of what the Haymakers is all about.
Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.